Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have my January wrap-up. January was one of those months where I was trying to compete with the amount of books that I read last year and I spectacularly failed. I wanted this year to get off to a good start and I think it did, but I'm just not impressed with my reading this month. There are a lot of duds in this wrap-up. But the first book in this wrap-up was a reread for me. It wasn't a dud. Indeed, it actually was more impactful upon a second reading, and that book is Don't Call Us Dead by Danez Smith. The way I read poetry collections is probably not the correct way to read poetry collections. I've said this before, because I will read them straight through and I will stop at certain poems that maybe I felt like needed more time over, but it's only upon rereading that I ever seem to actually be able to grasp more of the poems. Other readers will likely read one poem and mull over it and unpick it. I don't do that. I read them, I say whether I enjoy them, whether they hit me enough the first time. I don't know what it was about this book that when I read it a second time, I seem to appreciate it more, but I think that revisiting something that you have some prior knowledge of is often going to be the case that you are going to end up finding more in there than you did the first time. Still recommend it. Great way to start off my year. For a few years, I was following Ariel Bissett's example of rereading a favourite book at the start of every year, because then I knew that my reading was getting off to a good start. And I hadn't tried it with poetry, so I tried it with poetry and it was a brilliant way to set off 2020. Next, I finished listening to the audiobook of Hogfather by Terry Pratchett. If you watched my Vlogmas, then you will know that I was trying to get this book listened to over Christmas so that I could watch the adaptation, and neither of those things happened. I appreciated Hogfather because I like the stories about death. However, I did not enjoy this one as much as I have enjoyed previous ones in the series. It was nice to see Death's granddaughter. It was this nice blend of talking about the consumerism of Christmas as well as the classic ideas about Christmas, but this one, whilst funny, just didn't get me the same way that Mort and Guards and other Terry Pratchett books have done. Next, I read The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. This is a book told in the poetic form following Michael, a young gay teen who is mixed race, and he is coming up against a few struggles throughout his life. Michael has always liked things that are more commonly associated with femininity. I got the sense that Michael had a great support network around him, and I appreciated that. And you got this conflict between Michael and his heritage. I think this book is brilliant for its target market, however, I did find it too simple for my tastes. But I think with the story that Dean Atta was trying to tell, that he did a great job. The only issue I had was that in the blurb it said that at university, take a seat in the audience and watch him find his wings as a drag artist at the Black Flamingo. But I don't think that that is what this book was about. Yes, Michael struggles with his identity, but the Black Flamingo part of the story doesn't come into it until incredibly late. As if I'd had this book as a teenager, I would be appreciating it a lot more than I appreciate it now. That isn't to detract from the book. I think that it would be a great book for any LGBTQIA teens that are out there. And it talks about gender, and it talks about race, and it talks about sexuality in ways that when I was younger I wasn't seeing as much of in YA literature. So I am appreciative that this book exists, and if you do have any young people in your lives, then I heartily recommend that you gift them this book. Next, I read Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs by Caitlin Doughty. Caitlin Doughty is popular for the Ask a Mortician series on YouTube. I have previously read Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, but I haven't read her second non-fiction book. This is a series of questions that the author received and she answers them in a question and answer format. Sometimes I did think that she veered off at tangents that didn't really make sense to the question that she had been asked. And honestly, I prefer her long form non-fiction as opposed to this question and answer style. Yes, I learnt some things that I didn't previously know, but other things I'd learnt from her books. So I think, again, this is a book for the younger reader, though her fans will probably appreciate it. It's formatted in an easily digestible way, but I just don't think that it was especially brilliant, and I don't think that it was trying to be that either. Next, I listened to Interesting Times by Terry Pratchett. I don't know how far into the Discworld series I am now, but this was me actually going back and filling in the gaps of the books that I hadn't read between one book and Hogfather. I have never been a fan of Rincewind's stories. I know that he's in The Colour of Magic and The Light Fantastic, and that's because of those books. It took me a very long time to actually go on and continue the series because I wasn't the biggest fan of Rincewind's books. There's something about them that I don't find them as funny as the other books. Whilst it might not have been the case, I couldn't help but dislike this caricature of China and the legends and myths that he was going into and the way he was trying to twist the story for certain things. Now, I know that he often parodies things, and these books are very much like carry-on style takes on other literatures and other fictions, films even, that are out there. Popular media gets parodied a lot in Terry Pratchett's fiction, and I can appreciate that, but whilst this book had its funny moments, it very much felt like a paint-by-numbers of a Discworld book, and I wasn't the biggest fan of it. Next, I read my own book, which is An Heir to Murder. This releases on the 12th of this month. Next, I read The Crown Conspiracy from this bind-up Theft of Swords by Michael J. Sullivan, and this book follows, I'm going to have to look, Royce and Hadrian, and they go on these dangerous assignments that I've just read on the blurb. Basically, I had to think about the context a lot when reading this book. These two men get tasked with going and stealing a sword. Only when they arrive, the king has been murdered and somebody is blaming them for his murder. Then a princess helps them escape by taking her brother with them, and it's this whole thing going across these lands. And the reason I say that context means a lot is because Michael J. Sullivan says that he wrote this for his child that had dyslexia, and that he wanted to keep it simple fantasy. For me, it was too simple. Each chapter just saw them meeting a new character. There was no character growth in the story at all. Again, it felt like this caricature of fantasy, and I didn't think that this simple writing was good simple writing. Like, you can still have like simple bare prose and have it be good, but this did just feel like a child was writing their first bit of comprehensive text and they've been told that they had to write 3 adjectives before each noun, so that's what he was doing. I don't think that the dialogue sounded like actual dialogue. The whole reason I wanted to read this series was because I'd seen it recommended as something for fans of the Greatcoat series, that these two had great banter and a great relationship with each other, and I didn't get that relationship. I didn't understand it. Great that a self-published book ended up getting picked up by a major traditional publisher, and that the series is doing great. It's got fans in its millions. I am not one of them. I'll be handing this bind up over to my cousin, and I won't be reading on with the series, which I'm disappointed with because I thought I was invested enough that I could go on and read all of these books, but that's not right. I can't. I don't like them. Next, I read My Purple Scented Novel by Ian McEwan. The less said about this book, the better. Next, I read The Binding by Bridget Collins. Next, I read James Acaster's classic Scrapes, and I'm glad I got this book secondhand. I can return it to the shop now, and I mention it in a vlog about how I finished it and read on the back that this cost someone £10 to buy, and I was astounded because it was not worth that much. Most of the stories he's telling, he's previously shared on the radio. Other times he's shared them in television shows, so a lot of the humour that I saw on the television wasn't here because it just ends up bloating the stories a bit to fill up his page count. Next, I read A Single Thread by Tracy Chevalier. I have a review of this as well. Now we get to a book that I didn't hate, and I started reading for cozy reading night, and that book is Night Boat to Tangier by Kevin Barry. This book follows the characters of Charlie and Maurice, or Morris, I never properly figured out how to say it. These two former Irish gangsters waiting at a port because Morris's daughter went missing a few years earlier and they have been trying to find her. The humour in here reminded me of a Coen Brothers film. There was something dark and hilarious within the tale of these two men who were clearly past it, trying to emphasise how hard nut they were. You get the idea that the world has moved on without them. The prose is very stark and very bare, similar to what I was saying Michael J. Sullivan could have done, because even though it was sparse, it was incredibly effective to do it that way. Nothing ever became too melodramatic. It was this tone throughout that added to this sinister effect that Kevin Barry had created over the entire story, while still managing to evoke some humour there. I'm not yet sure who the narrator was in this story, and as I was reading it, I was thinking about how I couldn't wait to go back and reread those parts. I think that the characters were sketched really well, because you get the sense that this is almost like a darker form of a buddy comedy, and that these two men are also friends but can also very quickly become enemies with each other. It's this strange sense of brotherhood between them. I completely adored this book. I was invested in the characters. At first, I didn't think I was going to be. I said that I was struggling with it because it seemed that it could have just been a script, but soon I realised that the writer was trying to create a rhythm within the text for the story. It goes back and forth. The story isn't linear at all. I loved the things that this book was doing, and I think that it achieved everything it was setting out to do. And I really do look forward to revisiting it at some point in the future, because it just hit every single mark that I wanted it to. Next, we have Women Talking by Miriam Toews. I can't pronounce that name at all, but I read this book for the BookTube Prize. Next, we have Deep Fields by Philip Gross. This is a poetry collection Joy lent me on Thursday, and I read it on Thursday night, and I was completely blown away. Honestly, I was astounded. This is a collection where each of the poems builds upon the previous poem. They're surrounding this theme and the fact that Philip Gross lost his father. Before he lost his father, he was losing his father because his father had lost his ability to communicate. Is it aphasia? Is that how they pronounce it? Is that what it's called? I'm very sorry if I've got that wrong. But these poems, there were moments where the poet would include brackets and you'd have to keep going back and rereading it, and it forced you to reread the poems and to connect things. I loved the confusion because it felt like it captured the confusion that the people who went through this were actually experiencing. There is the sense of biography in here, a sense of loneliness and this grief within here that was incredibly powerful and moving to read about. It was reminding me of things that I've gone through previously or I have seen other people going through. It discusses difficult topics, but it's still incredibly poetic and evocative, and just brilliant what this poet managed to capture with such brevity. We finished off January reading another poetry collection. This month was bookended by poetry, and this book is Fleche by Mary Jean Chan. Mary Jean Chan is discussing queerness, discussing the body, discussing her relationship with her mother, her relationship with her heritage. There are definitely poems in here that I reread whilst I was going. There's a whole thing about a tea ceremony close to the end, and the way that poem was told, it just felt like it was so entrenched with meaning. Once again, I found myself astounded by a poetry collection. I was reading it wishing that I could write like this. I am grateful that this book has been recommended so many times because it did everything that I like to see. There were things going on with form that I haven't seen before. They might be popular, I haven't read enough poetry to say, but I liked discovering it, and it never felt too obtuse or obscure for me to understand what was being said. There was a clarity, but it also felt full of knowledge, if that makes any sense. Sometimes poets who are knowledgeable can give you all the information and you don't have the necessary knowledge yourself to unpick it. And it didn't feel like you were being spoon-fed. Felt closer to the poet whilst reading them, but also, as with all poetry, you're bringing your own experiences in. It was a brilliant experience to read this. And them's the books. If you have read any of these books and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.